IoT development hype these days? Well, my answer is yes, it is. I'm biased, but Ben Jack here from Spindance has some experience in implementing projects and some interesting perspective on how hype and for whom IoT development is. Hey everyone, this is the IoT Show. I'm Olivier, your host. Today we have Ben to discuss how hype IoT development is these days. Hey Ben, how are you?
I am doing quite well. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm living the dream. Um,
Perfect.
hopefully it's not someone else's. It's my dream, right?
Right.
So IoT is hype, and before we get into that topic, how about you introduce yourself and Spindance, the company you work for? Tell us a bit about you.
Yeah. So you said my name is Ben Jacques. I've been in the software development world for 15 years now. It's actually my degree is in electrical engineering. I thought I wanted to get into board design, thought that was going to be super fun. And then turns out software was way more fun. So I kind of made a pivot, and really a lot of my background is in computer vision and automation. Did a lot in the automotive world, and then eventually moved over here to Spindance, which is a software development studio consulting company that's really focused on IoT. We can kind of do general software stuff, but IoT is sort of our bread and butter, which is super fun for me. You can get to see all sorts of different customers from all sorts of different industries with lots of really cool projects, both in the IoT space and then still being able to bring in some of that computer vision and machine learning background. So yeah, it's been 15 years of a ton of fun in the software space, and I just enjoy it every day.
Yeah, I'm like you. Started my career at the intersection of hardware and software, and I always wanted to stay close to hardware because it's fun, but software was where things were at, and so it was definitely the path forward. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. And as we'll discuss today, it's more and more accessible to many different types of developers these days. But let's discuss the first question for you. What is your definition of an IoT developer?
Ooh, that's a good question. So for me, it's very different. But an IoT developer is somebody who loves to learn because it's more than just developing for mobile, and it's more than just developing for cloud, and it's more than just developing for embedded. You need to understand, at least understand how all of those different domains talk to each other and interweave with each other. So for me, if you're a developer in IoT, you need to be maybe focused in one of those domains, but understand the higher level picture of how all of the things work together, which is not easy to do, but it's super fun when you do.
No, it is, and it actually extends your interest, the project scope that you're working on, and all those kind of things. We had a discussion earlier on was one of the first episodes since I rebooted the IoT show was Rob Tiffany about what does it take to become an IoT developer, and he had the same comment as yours, which was IoT is about the entire thing, the big picture, right? And so you have to have an understanding of everything, and you get to touch a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So what is the trend, and that's related to what we just discussed? What is the latest trends you're seeing in the IoT space from a developer standpoint?
Yeah, so a couple interesting things that we've seen. When I first started in IoT officially, maybe 4 years ago, everything was Java. That was the king. Java Spring Boot in the cloud. That's how you're developing all of your applications. And since I started here at Spindance 4 years ago, we have yet to do a Java project. Almost everything in the cloud has moved to C Sharp if you're on Azure, or TypeScript or Python if you're using AWS, and a
Mhm.
lot of those Java skills have kind of gone away. So that's one thing we've seen on the cloud side.
Okay.
In the mobile side, we've seen a lot of things move toward cross-platform development. It was kind of this big question of like, is this really going to take off? And for most IoT applications that aren't super hardware intensive on the mobile side, cross-platform has been just a way more cost-effective way to go. And then on the embedded side, we're seeing a lot more trends toward higher end devices, especially things that have a UI to them, which kind of takes you not necessarily, but oftentimes out of the microcontroller RTOS world and into something like embedded Linux, where it's a little bit more higher level application development than what we have typically seen in IoT. Those are three kind of big trends across
Okay.
various domains that at least we've seen.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. And do you feel that embedded development, I don't say IoT on purpose, right? Because you mentioned cloud, you mentioned the higher end type of devices that
Yeah.
are steering away from the hardware, or abstracting the hardware to a certain level. And they're like, developers there are focusing on the UI, on this kind of aspects. Are you seeing the embedded development interaction with the hardware becoming easier these days? Do you see any trends there?
Yeah, I mean, it's embedded is still hard, no matter what your platform is. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot more, uh, a lot easier transition for people moving into the embedded space on those higher level platforms to be able to interact with hardware. And that's actually kind of a cool trend we've seen coming from the maker space, where they've really been able to abstract away some of the complexity of how do you talk over a SPI bus? How do you talk over UART? How do you talk over these different types of interfaces, I squared C, or even interacting with GPIO that used to be a giant pain, and now my son can do it with this little Arduino kit, and we've
Faster
seen some
than
of
you,
that.
faster than you, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. I see him connect up to a SPI bus, and then I open my C code with my RTOS, and I'm like, I kind of like how Arduino does it.
Yeah. And do you think like Arduino is making things easier? It's been focusing on the makers market and ecosystem for a long time. They are now offering a pro line of hardware, and they're trying to bring all their software and so on to the pro business as well. Wilderness Labs is bringing .NET to microcontrollers in a like full .NET. It's a very interesting trend as well. There's other areas where I've seen, not I wouldn't say the maker space, but this notion of democratizing embedded development for more developers, not to keep it confidential to the ones who know or understand C, C++, or want to do C, C++. But are you actually seeing in production such solutions with software on the embedded side of things that are departing from C and C++?
Yeah, yeah, we actually have a couple of projects. I'm watching the Arduino Pro one really closely because I think there's a lot of potential there. But
Mhm.
we've certainly seen it with Raspberry Pi. They've kind of come out with more of these, industrial level things, and we've actually had two big projects in the last couple of years that have been built on either the Raspberry Pi, more of an industrial version, or the Pi 4 compute module. And so we're using Yocto as a build system to create the Linux OS, and then either developing in Python or web applications, or actually in one production application right now, we're building the whole UI and kind of machine backend in Dart and Flutter, which is crazy that our embedded developers that were so used to C, C++ are now able to write these beautiful UIs in Flutter and still have full machine control over the hardware that they need to with Dart, which is just a very different world than what they're
Yeah.
used to.
Yeah. And it feels like there is this general trend that we're seeing embedded developers starting to do a bit more of different things, right? Learning these higher level development stacks, frameworks, and so on, because they can.
Mhm.
Prior to the actual era we're living in, they were confined to C and C++ because that's what they
Mhm.
had for embedded development. So these developers are getting to use more modern languages and tools, but the other way around as well. Developers who are not hardware or firmware or embedded developers now get to start playing with hardware thanks
Mhm.
to these more modern tools that are coming up, right?
Yeah, yep. Which is, our developers love it because we tend to have people that are really curious and want to learn everything and want to know how all these systems interact together, and being able to have that little higher level picture of the hardware just makes it easier, especially for our mobile developers that are doing a lot of like Bluetooth interaction with an IoT device. Being able to quickly move from that mobile space, understand what's happening on the embedded side, see how that actually gets down to the hardware level, has been super fun for me to watch and super fun for them to do.
Yeah. So Ben, we when we discussed, this episode and what we want to talk about, I hope people like whether they're embedded developers or non-embedded developers, will start looking closer at what's going on. You actually used a term that was the second gen for IoT projects and platforms. Can you tell me more about, how do you think we are entering in that second generation of IoT projects these days?
Yeah. This is something we're seeing as a trend within industry, and I think it's really cool to see that everything goes through a hype cycle. Everything kind of comes and goes and falls off, and then we figure out how to actually practically use it. And I think what we're seeing right now as a trend in the IoT space is that IoT is here to stay. We've found that it's really useful in everyday life when you use it in the right ways. We saw a lot of really probably poor use cases of IoT in the last 10 years, and we've seen a lot of ways that it's totally revolutionized our lives. And so what we're seeing now is actually a lot of customers that maybe jumped into the IoT space early. They got some products out to market. There was some success with customers, but at the end of the day, the way that they built it wasn't great. And so they're kind of revisiting how they approach IoT now and really taking a step back, taking all the learnings that the whole industry has done over the last 5 or 10 years and saying, how do we now do IoT right? We may have just purchased this off the shelf platform that we can do most of what we want, but we can't quite do everything that we want. Or we don't really have ownership of our own code and our devices, which is kind of terrifying. And so some companies are coming back and saying, how do I build a platform or products that I really own, I really understand, I can really customize it to make it what my users really need and want, which feels like a new breath of fresh air into the IoT space, where everybody's ready to dig in and say, "Yep, it's here to stay, and we really want to do it right."
Yeah, and back to the overall topic here of the discussion, it makes it even more hype because even more interesting. And one thing I've seen is that IoT projects and solutions are about this end-to-end story. Right. So you don't build IoT. One of the reasons I've seen lots of IoT projects fail, as you were describing, is because like companies wanted to do IoT for the sake of doing IoT because it was this hype thing, and they didn't really think about a use case because they didn't want to or didn't do the work of stepping back to look at the big picture and what the end-to-end use cases and value add were. And so they were just like, hey, we need to IoTify, we need to connect because that's the trend. We're digitally transforming, but they were not really thinking about that end-to-end. But now, if you're entering this world of IoT development, for your career, if you're a developer, think about it as an opportunity to not just like code in your corner on your little tiny feature. Now you need to consider the story. You need to have notion of what's happening in the cloud, how you connect the device, how you interact with hardware. And this is super interesting at an era where coding is becoming not a commodity. I don't want to any of the developers on my back, but
Right.
dev tools and generative AI and all these tools will allow you to spend more time on the bigger picture and the use cases. And from my perspective, it makes that even more interesting, right?
Yes. Yep, for sure. I mean, and you kind of said it at the beginning, for you and for me both, having some connection to the actual hardware when you're doing software is just, it's really cool to be able to see how what you're working on interacts with the real
Mhm.
world. And when you interact with the real world, that also means you're probably interacting with human beings. So how
Sure.
they use your product, how they experience it, kind of gives you a connection back to, I'm writing software, but it's meaningful in some way and it's impacting someone in some way, which I think just makes it a lot more meaningful as a career and as a developer, that you get to really impact people's lives in a good way.
Yeah. Well put. I like that. And so, if people want to learn more about IoT, well, they can follow the IoT show here. If they have interesting projects that they need help with, Spindance can help them out, right? So I guess we're going to put some link down there for people to find you, and they can also follow you on LinkedIn, and reach out directly, whether if they have career questions about IoT or if they have interesting project that they need support for in the realm of IoT. Ben, thanks a lot for your time today. And well, I hope to see you again on the IoT show sometime soon.
Yes, sounds great. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
See you, everyone. Bye.
Yep. See you.